So we're in your United States history book. We're in chapter 2, and we're going on. We let off with the Pilgrims, and now we're going to be talking about the Puritans. Well, the Pilgrims were a type of Puritan, a separatist. More than a Puritan, they were a separatist. As the Pilgrims came, they had a little different idea than when the Puritans come. When the Puritans came, they too came for religious freedom. And most of them settled at first, as we know, in the Massachusetts Bay here, where you see where Salem and Boston is. And see, here's where Plymouth is down here. This is all Massachusetts, but you can see with the difference there, where Plymouth, where the Pilgrims settled, and on to Boston and Massachusetts. It says the Puritans were the second religious group to begin settlement in Massachusetts. They followed the Pilgrim separatists, and they built villages around Boston. Most Puritan settlers arrived between 10 and 20 years after the Pilgrims. So we're thinking way later than the Pilgrims. And most of the Puritans did not allow religious freedom. The Pilgrims relied on complete religious freedom. Remember William Bradford? He said basically he wanted to bring forth the gospel, but he was not going to force the gospel on anyone, right? But the Pilgrims did not allow the Puritans did not allow the religious freedom as the Pilgrims did. And they passed laws, for their public schools in the midst of all that. So here's the Puritans, and they're settling in Massachusetts Bay. So let's talk about this migration of Puritans to the New World. Massachusetts Bay Company. Well, King Charles, he lived 1600 to 1649, vowed to rule without a parliament. He didn't want a parliament. He wanted to rule like he was king and that he was the head of it all, and he really didn't want to have advice from the parliament. So he threatened English liberties as never before. We're talking about England. In 1629, he issued a charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. This he gave with joint stock with these businessmen, which were mainly Puritans. And at that time, the Puritans had before pretty much had trying to, the controlment of, I should say, of the Parliament. But he had these businessmen that were mostly Puritan. And he granted a tract of land of territory controlled by the Council of New England. And this charter failed to stipulate that the company remain in England. So basically, these Puritans thought, well, we could come to America and not have the same control, and have our own charter, and not be so controlled by England in per se. And this gave unique opportunity for Puritan religious freedom in America. So the stockholders began to migrate to the New World. In fact, we find Puritans coming over, wealthy Puritans, and, shiploads of Puritans coming over to Massachusetts Bay. Enabled the Puritans to take this charter with them. Now they had a charter, and establish a self-governing colony of Massachusetts. So these 12 wealthy Puritan businessmen took control of the Massachusetts Bay Company. So you see this picture. Let me show. There we go. So, city upon a hill. You find that in the Bible, don't we? Well, John Winthrop, he lived 1588 to 1649, became the governor, we're talking about, of Massachusetts, of the Puritan Massachusetts cities. And on April 1630, a fleet of 11 ships came with 1,000 passengers, mostly Puritans, that had sailed here for religious freedom from England. They anticipated persecution, but the persecution never happened in America. And they had the pursuit of a city set upon a hill. It's a noble pursuit, to build a society that would fully embody God's truth. Winthrop, that was his idea. His famous words is, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of the people are upon us." So that was the Puritan belief in America, that they could come and be a light and be a city, like a city on a hill, shining in the world. The Puritan belief in Massachusetts. The Great Migration of these Puritans had begun. In 1630, they established Boston and several other towns, and they grew up rapidly despite hardships that they had to go through. In 1633, there were more persecution in England. England started persecuting the Puritans more, and basically England having the Anglican Church, they did not want the Puritans to have freedom of religion. And so the Great Migration went on, the migration to America. In 1642, 25,000 Puritans prospered in Massachusetts Bay Colony. See these pictures here of them coming and preaching of the Bible. Important political principles. Well, they strongly emphasized the responsibility of citizens to obey the civil magistrates and uphold them in prayer. So they didn't go against the in obeying those that were in charge, did they? So number one, the government was limited by consent of the governed. Number two, the citizens participated in the government and chose their leaders. Number three, the government would protect private property. Those were the main important principles of this Puritan government in Massachusetts. So they were limited by the consent of the governed. That means the people had a limit where the people could actually be voiced in the government. And the citizens could choose their leaders, and they would protect their private property. I like this one. It says, what is a Puritan? A Puritan is a member of a 17th century religious sect that immigrated from England to what is now the United States. Their beliefs have had a profound influence on American society for hundreds of years. Problems in Massachusetts. The Puritans did have problems of their, 25,000 people coming at once. So they did not really believe in separation of church and state as the same degree as the Pilgrims. Remember, the Pilgrims believed in religious freedom, but they wanted basically to have the government run in a Puritan manner that feared without the church they couldn't be a city sit on the hill. So they needed to have the church still in charge at that point in Massachusetts. So they placed power in a general court assembly with certain freemen running the general court, and most of them, practically all of them in the beginning, were Puritans. They were growing extremely fast, and they elected officers and granted powers at this point. That this violated the colony's charter. So in 1634, some sent delegates demanding Winthrop to show the charter. So they had a charter, but in England, they thought, this colony is actually violating what we said in the charter. So they had demanded Winthrop to show the charter. So there was a compromise. The freemen of each town would elect 2 representatives to the general court. So they had to come into what the Massachusetts charter and obeying what England had promised them in the charter. So another problem. New churches had to have consent of the Puritans' authority. So the Puritans, they were not really allowing, new churches to come in unless they were Puritan churches. These churches were congregational churches, and each was self-governed. The Puritan ministers did have a very great authority in the land, and the Puritan ministers had to approve the other ministers. So only approved church members, freemen, were allowed to vote and hold office. So they were all Puritans holding office in the Bay Colony in Massachusetts Bay. This did lead to serious problems and political and religious problems too, because a lot of them became hypocrites. they would say that they were really Puritans, but they wouldn't act like Puritans in the sense, just because they knew that Puritans had control. You know, they could be falsely, would have a religious sense. Instead of having a relationship with the Lord, they would have a religious relationship with religion and man's ways. Isn't that what happens? And this led to discrimination and even persecution among certain people if they did not say that they were Puritan. So they actually came upon what they feared most in England, and they were becoming like what was going on and how they were persecuted in England. But the American Puritan heritage, despite its faults, was endowed America with a rich heritage. They promoted biblical morality in general, and individual responsibility, industry, frugality, and education. And of course, we have the Puritan work ethic. It's basically the belief that work is a gift from God, and a way to glorify Him is through our work. So hard work and industry and keen business sense were Puritan values, and those values which we value today too. So Americans' Puritan heritage. So that's it for this part of the chapter. So we'll continue in a bit.